So we sort of divide bone growth up into sort of 3 different aspects. So the first one that I walked you through already is growth in an embryo. So how do bones form to begin with? We walked through that. I talked about how bones form 2 different ways. Intramembranous ossification is how the bones of the skulls and the clavicle forms. And then we also talked about endochondral ossification, which is how all the rest of the bones form, which essentially means they form from a cartilage, hyaline cartilage pre-skeleton. So we walked through that. And so now we're going to talk about after a baby is born, they're obviously going to grow, right? They're going to get taller, they're going to get bigger, their bones are going to grow in length. So how does that happen? And we call this process postnatal bone growth. Post means after, and natal means birth. So this literally means bone growth after birth. So your bones are going to grow from the growth plate. Okay? The growth plate is basically cartilage. It's just a bar of cartilage in there. What's going to happen is the cartilage in the growth plate is basically going to get thicker. And then underneath, we're going to replace that cartilage. We're going to break it down and replace it with bone. So the diaphysis of the bone is just going to continue to get longer and longer and longer. So like right now, my son is going through a big growth spurt, and his growth plates are really thick right now. And I know this because we thought he broke his ankle the other day. And I took him to the pediatrician and they did an x-ray. And the pediatrician said there are no fractures in the bone, but his growth plate is really thick. And guess what you can't see on an x-ray? Cartilage. All you can see is bone. So he said there could be a break in the cartilage in the growth plate, and we just aren't going to be able to see it on an x-ray. So if it continues to hurt and continues to be swollen for longer than a week, then we have to go to an orthopedist, right? So the growth plate is truly where the bones are growing from. And so let's talk about the growth plate. Remember, we call it the epiphyseal plate. That growth plate has 3 different zones in it. A growth zone, which is where the cartilage is growing from. A transformation zone. What does that word remind you of? Like when you hear transformation. To transform means to change, right? So this would be the zone where we're going to change from cartilage into something else, okay? And then osteogenic, osteo means bone. This is where we're going to form that bone. Okay? So those are kind of the 3 zones within the growth plate. So let's talk about these 3 zones in a little more detail. So again, the growth zone is the area of the growth plate where the cartilage cells are, where the cartilage is growing. So the cells are secreting more cartilage matrix, and they are truly pushing the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. So the way that I think about bone growth is like, I know that, okay, I would say that, okay, let's pretend that like all of this right here, let's pretend that this is the diaphysis. And then my fist up here is the epiphyses, and the space in between is the growth plate. Okay, you with me so far? So what's going to happen is the growth plate is going to grow. Okay, so it gets fatter. And then underneath, we're going to replace it with bone. So we've just made the diaphysis get longer. So this is truly like when I think of it, that's how I think about bones growing. So in the growth zone, the cartilage is growing, we're getting more cartilage, that growth plate's getting bigger and thicker. Underneath that, we have that transformation zone where we're going to start to kill off the cartilage and we're going to start to calcify the matrix in the cartilage. Now remember, when you calcify a matrix, we don't turn it into bone that way. All you're doing is you're making the matrix hard. Does cartilage have a blood supply? No. How does it get nutrients? Diffusion, right? Do you think it's harder for nutrients to diffuse through a calcified matrix or easier? A lot harder, right? If you take a cartilage matrix and you add calcium and you make it really hard, well, now nutrients don't diffuse through that very well. So what's going to happen is a lot of the cells are going to start to die because they're not going to be able to get nutrients. So this is why we call it the transformation zone. These cells are dying. We're killing the cartilage here. And then we're going to replace it with bone. And that is what this osteogenic zone is. Right? So we grow the cartilage, we kill the cartilage, and we replace it with bone. So let me show you a picture. This is looking at a long bone, and we are looking just at the growth plate, just the epiphyseal plate. And so remember, we have these 3 zones. The first zone is our growth zone, okay? That proliferation zone, growth zone. And I want you to notice, this is hyaline cartilage, right? The background looks really pretty and glassy. It's nice and purple and pretty back there. And remember, hyaline means glassy. What do you notice about the chondrocytes in lacuna up here in terms of their arrangement? How are they arranged or situated? Are they in a hodgepodge? Are they all over the place? They're kind of stacked on each other, right? They almost look like stacks of coins. That's how you know that this cartilage is growing. Because what's happening is a chondrocyte goes through mitosis, makes a new one, and puts it right on top. So when you see a tissue like that, where you have stacks of cells, you know that it's growing. Under that, down in here, all of this area, this is our transformation zone. So remember, I told you we're going to grow the cartilage up here in the growth zone, and then we're going to kill the cartilage in the transformation zone. So in this area, what's happening is the cartilage matrix, that extracellular matrix, we're calcifying it, it's getting hard, can't get the nutrients to the cells, and the cells are starting to die. You know they're dying, because if you look up here, notice the size of the lacuna. They are way bigger than they were up here in the growth zone. That means that these cells are going through what's called hypertrophy. They're enlarging. And when a cell does that, it's getting ready to die. And if you look, some of these lacuna are even empty. So they don't even contain a cell anymore. So the cartilage cells are dying. We've calcified the matrix. We're killing off those cells. And once we've killed off the cells, now that cartilage is dead and we can replace it with bone underneath. And that's what this bottom layer is. This is our ossification zone, where we're going to replace all of that cartilage with bone. In terms of your bones growing, you can see here that, again, they're growing from the epiphyseal plate, which is right here, because this is why we call it the growth plate. And this is how they're going to grow in length. The diaphysis is going to get longer, and it's going to push the epiphyses away from the diaphysis. The image on the right, this is showing you bone remodeling, which is what we're going to talk about next. Okay? Bone remodeling is not necessarily your bones growing in length anymore, right? I told you on Monday, I'm 5'6". I think I was 5'6" at 13. So I was done growing by then. But my bones are still, to this day, remodeling. They're changing shape based on the force and the demands that I put on them. So you can see in this picture on the right, they're trying to show you the bone was here, where this red line is, before it was sort of resorbed in certain areas and added in others. Now, before we get into bone remodeling, I do want to talk a little bit more about your bones growing. And I want to talk about what causes your bones to grow. I just told you a minute ago, my son is in a growth spurt, right? He's 9. He's going through this big growth spurt. He's hungry. He sleeps all the time. And so little kids during infancy and childhood, that growth plate activity, epiphyseal plate activity, is stimulated by a hormone that comes from the pituitary gland, which is in the brain. It's called the human growth hormone, HGH for short. So babies, small kids, they go through growth spurts in response to the human growth hormone, and it's going to cause their bones to grow in length. But as soon as that child gets old enough and starts going through puberty, it's no longer the human growth hormone that is causing them to hit those growth spurts. It now becomes sex hormones. So these are going to be things like estrogen and testosterone. Now, these sex hormones are also going to promote growth spurts. You know, when kids go through puberty, they start going through these huge growth spurts. But it's these sex hormones that are also going to change the skeleton a little bit. So it will cause the skeleton to become more masculinized or more feminized, depending on which hormone's being released. So let me pull it up here. So I have this pelvis model that you can see. Okay, so this is just a human pelvis. There's one on the right, one on the left. One is female, one is male. They look a little different, don't they? One of them has a much wider opening. One of them has hips that are flared out a little bit more, right? That's the female pelvis. Those changes are in response to estrogen, okay? The one over here on the right, this is the male pelvis. It is more narrow. Narrower hips help to support the heavier upper body of a male. Whereas the wider, more flared hips, this bigger opening, helps to support carrying a baby. So we'll see changes. That's just one example, but we'll see changes in the skeleton in response to these sex hormones. Eventually, these sex hormones are also going to result in the closure of the growth plates. So the epiphyseal plates will close, and that's going to cause you to not grow in length anymore. Now, for women, our growth plates will close pretty early. Usually by the time we're about 15, our growth plates have closed. Men, their growth plates can stay open into their early 20s, so they can continue to grow until their early 20s.